The house smelled like old wood and untouched memories, but it was the barn behind it that made my chest tighten. "He left me everything," he said, "yet some things are never meant to be inherited." At dusk, the shadows inside that barn seemed to move on their own, whispering secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Clara Monroe, newly widowed, returns to the rural property her late husband left her, a modest farmhouse with a creaking barn on the edge of the fields. The town is quiet, the air heavy with the scent of late autumn, and the house feels both familiar and foreign, as if holding the ghost of a life she never fully understood. She hopes for closure, but instead, the place hums with hidden histories, small silences, and things left unsaid. The gravel crunched under my tires, each stone like a small confession I hadn't asked to hear. The road stretched thin and winding, flanked by trees whose leaves whispered against one another. Sunset hung low, bleeding gold through the branches, painting the farmhouse ahead like a silhouette I barely recognized. I parked slowly, engine ticking as it cooled, and stayed seated for a long minute. The air smelled of dry leaves and dust, the kind of smell that lingers even when no one's home. I watched the house, its windows catching the last light, catching me. I'd left here for years, or maybe just left myself behind. I opened the door. The gravel shifted under my shoes as I approached. The front step was cool, worn smooth from years of footsteps I would never know. I ran my hand along the railing, feeling splinters bite softly at my skin. Inside, the air was different. Heavy, still, waiting. Dust motes floated lazily through the streaks of sunlight that cut across the floor. Everything smelled faintly of wood and something older. Old curtains, old walls, old regrets. The furniture sat like strangers frozen in memory. A chair had a fabric pattern I almost recognized. A desk bore indentations where papers had rested. Every object seemed to hum quietly with someone else's presence. I could almost hear him here, though I knew better. I walked slowly, my fingers brushing over the edge of a table, lingering on the smoothness of the worn wood. Each step made the floor creak, like it remembered. The house didn't just hold my husband's things, it held him in the shape of absence. I realized I was holding my breath. The silence of the house pressed against my chest. Then it came. A creak from the barn, sharp enough to make me start. My heart lifted into my throat. I stopped, listening. A thud followed, low, almost deliberate. My hands tightened on the railing of the stairwell. The sound echoed, bouncing between the walls and the rafters. Did the house always make these noises? Or was there someone else here, someone waiting for me? I walked toward the back door. The air shifted as I opened it, a chill brushing past my arms. The barn stood across the yard, its paint peeling, windows dark like eyes watching. I could see the dust floating in the shafts of dying light, catching faintly like a million tiny secrets. The grass had grown up around the posts, thick and unkempt, pressing against my shoes. I stepped onto the wooden porch that ran along the back, each board moaning under weight. The wind carried something faint, hay, dirt, maybe something older. A memory flickered, him closing the barn door quickly, muttering about chores, about how some things shouldn't be left out. I had laughed then, thinking he was being silly. Now the memory sat heavy on my chest. I reached for the handle of the barn door. It was colder than I expected, the metal biting into my palm. The door groaned as I pushed, swinging open slowly, reluctantly. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and quiet, like they were listening too. The smell of hay rose immediately, sweet, dry, and faintly sour. I took a step inside. The floor was uneven beneath my boots. Each step sent small clouds of dust into the sunlight streaking in from the windows above. I could see old tools leaning against walls, ropes coiled neatly, and forgotten jars gathering cobwebs. The barn wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. It had been waiting for me. Then another sound. A small thump, as if something heavy had shifted. I froze. My eyes darted to the shadows. Nothing moved. I breathed slowly, reminding myself that I was alone. Or maybe I wasn't. The barn seemed to hold its own memory of him, of all the times he'd come here, the quiet footsteps, the soft humming he never thought I'd notice. I sank down onto a crate, letting the quiet settle over me. The floor beneath me creaked again, like it remembered every time he had stepped here before. I thought of him, gone now, leaving me this house, this barn, this inheritance of silence. I realized that the weight I felt wasn't just in the furniture or the objects, it was in the air itself, in the walls, in the dust that caught the last light of day. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, a shadow shifted against the far wall. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure if it was real or just the memory of him pressing back through time. I stayed there a long moment, breathing, letting the barn breathe around me. The light faded slowly, leaving the corners dark, and I felt both watched and unbroken. I stood, brushing off my jeans, and stepped back toward the door. I didn't know what I would find, or if I would even find anything at all. The barn waited behind me, quiet and patient. I paused at the threshold, hand lingering on the handle. Something was in there, something I wasn't ready to name yet. But I knew I would return. The sun slipped fully below the horizon. The house stood silent, patient. And for the first time, I felt that maybe the silence wasn't empty. Maybe it was a kind of invitation. The barn smelled of earth and hay, heavy with the quiet weight of seasons. Light slanted through the cracks in the boards, thin ribbons cutting across dust motes that hung in the air, slow and patient. I ran my hand along the rough wood of a beam, feeling the grain press into my palm, and the faint metallic tang lingered under my fingertips. It was subtle, almost dismissible, but persistent. My boots crunched softly on scattered straw as I moved deeper, senses stretched, alert. The loft caught my eye before I could understand why. It was small, set above the main floor, a simple rectangle of wood and shadow. A padlock sealed the door, rusted lightly, as if forgotten. My mind tugged at me with images I hadn't yet allowed. The way he avoided this place, the way his smile had faltered when I asked questions, the gentle dismissals that now felt like shields. I pressed my palm to the cool wood, feeling the weight of absence, and wondered what it had kept hidden all these years. The air shifted as night began to settle outside. Shadows stretched long across the barn floor, moving slowly as if breathing. I lingered near the loft, imagining the door swinging open on its own, hinges whining in a soundless protest. My fingers twitched, drawn to the padlock, but something restrained me. Curiosity and fear intertwined, heavy and patient. I could almost hear him in the silence, the man I had loved, present and absent all at once, guarding something I was not meant to see. I stepped back and ran my hand through my hair, feeling the weight of memory press in. I remembered questions left unanswered, small exchanges brushed off, fleeting glances that held too much and said too little. The barn itself seemed to lean closer, the walls groaning softly in acknowledgement, carrying the scent of hay, dust, and that unplaceable metallic tang that hinted at secret things. My breath caught. Could this loft, this small hidden space, hold the truth I had been circling for so long? The wind outside rattled the barn's panels, soft and insistent. I pressed my ear against the loft door, listening. Silence answered, but it was not empty. It was full of potential, of secrets waiting. My heart picked up its pace, slow at first, then urgent, drumming softly against my ribs. I imagined the padlock turning in my hands, the door creaking upward, revealing whatever had been kept from me. But another thought held me back. What if I wasn't ready? What if some truths could never be unburied without changing everything I thought I knew? I circled the barn floor, boots pressing softly into the straw. My eyes caught shadows shifting, shapes that weren't there moments before. Night deepened, and with it, a strange intimacy settled over the space. The loft seemed alive, patient, aware. Memories of him flickered unbidden, the way he'd glance at me and smile without his eyes, the way he'd change the subject when I asked about this very barn. Each memory pressed against the present, tethering me to questions I could not yet voice. I leaned against a beam, letting my palm slide over rough wood, feeling the coolness seep into my skin. The metallic tang lingered faintly under my nose, subtle and insistent. I closed my eyes and breathed, trying to separate past from present, memory from imagination, but the lines blurred. I pictured the loft door moving slightly, just enough for a shadow to fall differently across the hay-strewn floor. The thought pricked my chest with unease, as if the barn itself were holding its breath, testing me. I sat down on a low bale of hay, boots brushing loose straw to the floor. Silence pressed in, full and heavy. The loft loomed above me, padlocked and unmoved, but present, insistent. I thought of all the questions I had once ignored, all the stories he had tucked away behind smiles and half-truths. And I realized, the barn had always been a keeper of secrets, and I had been circling it like an outsider, unaware of the depth of what it held. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn walls, whispering through cracks. I pressed my palms to my knees, letting the noise fill the space, grounding me. The loft was small, forgotten, sealed, but it was no longer just wood and nails. It had become a threshold, a quiet, patient challenge. What had he hidden, and why? And now, standing here alone, I knew I would have to face it sooner or later. The padlock waited, stubborn and rusted, but inevitable. I rose slowly, brushing straw from my coat, letting the weight of curiosity and apprehension settle into my bones. The loft had claimed the night, the barn, and the lingering metallic scent as its own. And I understood that the answers, when they came, would not just be about him, or me, or even this space. They would be about memory, love, protection, and the truths we hold for others, and ourselves. I stepped toward the loft once more, hand hovering near the padlock, heart quiet but insistent. Outside, the wind sighed through the barn panels, carrying cold air and possibility. And in that breath, I felt the threshold of everything I had avoided. One day, I would turn the key. One day, I would see what had been kept from me. For now, I stood in the shadows, listening to the barn, the night, and my own pulse, knowing the loft would wait. And so would I. The attic smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint tang of mothballs. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window, a thin, trembling line across the floorboards, catching the edges of forgotten boxes. I knelt beside a pile of crates, boots pressing softly into the warped planks, and discovered it, a leather-bound diary, its cover cracked and worn. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have been. I lifted it slowly, running a finger along the spine, feeling the subtle ridges of age, the coldness of leather warmed by decades of sunlight. Opening it, the handwriting startled me. Familiar, yet foreign. Loops and curves I had traced on folded notes once, written now with his hand, addressed to no one I could name. My breath slowed as I turned the pages, the paper brittle under my fingers. Each entry carried regret, a soft tremor of fear, and an unspoken apology that felt like it had been waiting for me all along. I traced the letters carefully, as if the motion itself might bridge the distance between then and now, between him and the man I thought I knew. The attic was quiet, save for the low groan of the house settling, a whispering companion to my discovery. I imagined him here, years ago, writing these lines with hands like mine, chest tight with things too heavy to say aloud. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cedar from the box beneath the diary. I could almost feel the pulse of his presence, lingering in the corners, folded between sentences, echoing in the gaps where words failed him. I read one entry, softly, lips moving, voice caught in the quiet. The words spoke of choices, fear, debts owed to time and people, of a truth that had pressed against him relentlessly. And as I read, I felt the space between us dissolve slightly, a trembling connection forming, delicate and fragile. He had carried so much in silence, not just from the world, but from me. I could see now how carefully he had lived around the edges of truth, shaping life with love, but leaving shadows. The sun shifted, the thin beam stretching across the diary, illuminating the curled edges of a page. I could feel my own pulse echoing against the attic floorboards, a rhythm matching his long-past heartbeat. Each entry was a whisper, a confession, a window into a fear he had never spoken aloud. I wanted to know why, and I was afraid of what knowing would demand. My hands trembled slightly as I turned another page, the leather creaking faintly, like a sigh. I leaned back against a box, letting the diary rest in my lap. The attic felt smaller, more intimate, as if the dust, the sunbeam, and the quiet had conspired to hold me here with him, across time. I thought about the life we had shared, the smiles, the quiet dinners, the fleeting touches, and realized how many moments had been tempered by something unspoken. How much of him had remained folded away, even as he loved me openly. The diary offered glimpses, and each one pressed gently against the heart, leaving both ache and understanding. Outside, a crow cawed, the sound sharp and sudden, pulling me back into the present. I closed the diary briefly, feeling the weight of history in my hands. The attic shadows seemed to lean closer, listening, patient. I felt both grief and gratitude, grief for what had been carried alone, and gratitude for the trace of truth he left behind, a bridge I had only just found. The diary did not explain everything, but it explained enough to tremble with recognition. I traced a finger across the final page, the ink smudged faintly with time, and felt a quiet release. The man I had loved had been whole, broken, and hidden all at once. He had written these lines knowing I might never see them, yet leaving them anyway. In that act, I felt his presence, not as a shadow of absence, but as a reminder of connection, however fragile. The attic smelled of wood and paper and sunlight. And in that scent, I felt a careful, gentle bridge between the past and the life still waiting below. I closed the diary, breathing slowly, letting the quiet fill the attic. The house seemed to exhale with me, settling into the soft creak of floorboards and the distant whisper of wind through the eaves. Outside, the sky was shifting toward late afternoon, pale and patient. I held the diary against my chest, feeling the weight of knowledge, of love, and of secrets finally shared, even across the divide of time. And for the first time, I understood. Some truths demand patience, some apologies exist only on paper, and some connections survive in the careful act of remembrance. I could not change the past, but I could carry its lessons, its tremors, its echoes forward. The attic no longer felt like a place of dust and boxes. It was a keeper of memory, a testament to love complicated and unspoken. And in that quiet understanding, I felt the faintest possibility of peace. The night settled heavy over the house, soft against the windows. I lay in bed, listening. The wind had died, leaving only the low groan of the old timber. Somewhere in the barn, I thought I heard footsteps, light and careful, pacing across the wooden floor. My heart beat unevenly, a quiet drum in the dark. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The house seemed different at night, larger, older, like it was breathing around me. Floorboards creaked beneath their own weight, doors whispered in their hinges. I told myself it was the house settling. I told myself it was nothing. But when I pressed my ear to the wall, I could swear I heard something else, a slow, shallow breathing, just beyond my room. Morning came pale and grey. I walked through the house room by room, each step careful, deliberate. The sunlight through the curtains threw long shadows across the floorboards, highlighting dust motes dancing like tiny, suspended secrets. I ran my fingers along every doorframe, every wall, listening with my hands. The texture of the wood was uneven, worn smooth in some places, splintered in others, as if each corner carried the memory of someone else's touch. The barn called to me more quietly during the day, but the signs were there, small, almost invisible, but deliberate. Near the loft, the wooden wall bore faint scratches. I knelt beside them, tracing the lines with my gloved fingers. They weren't random. They curved and stopped in ways that suggested attention, intention, presence. Someone had been here. Someone had reached for the loft. My stomach tightened. I pressed my palm to the scratches, imagining the hands that had left them. I wandered from room to room, my steps slow, each one listening. A draft brushed my neck. The floor creaked behind me, then quiet again. I questioned my own perception. The mind can play tricks when it's lonely, I told myself. But every sound, every movement in the shadows, felt deliberate. The house had a rhythm of its own. I felt like a visitor, not the inheritor. In the kitchen, I paused at the counter, fingers brushing over the worn wood. I could feel the history embedded in it, the small indentations left by cups, knives, hands long gone. It felt like the house was pressing against me, nudging, guiding, or maybe warning. I turned toward the barn, the distant smell of hay and old wood drifting in through the cracked window. The scratches near the loft had left a chill on my skin, a memory I hadn't yet lived. That night, I returned to the barn. Moonlight spilled through the gaps in the boards, painting pale stripes across the floor. The air smelled faintly of damp hay, dust, and something older, metallic. I walked slowly toward the loft, boots crunching softly over stray straw. I could hear the faintest creak of floorboards above, as if the loft itself remembered every step that had ever touched it. I crouched near the scratches, examining them more closely. Each line suggested movement, hesitation, purpose. I imagined the figure who had been here, moving quietly in the dark, careful not to disturb the rest of the house. My hands shook slightly as I ran my fingers along the grooves. Whoever had been here had done it deliberately, and for reasons I could not yet understand. I stepped back, listening. A soft sound, just beyond the barn doors, made me freeze. Breathing? Or wind? My pulse quickened. The space seemed alive, humming with something I couldn't name. I wanted to call out, to announce my presence, but I didn't. I felt as though speaking would shatter the fragile connection between the house, the barn, and whatever lingered here. I left the barn slowly, each step measured, eyes flicking to the loft one last time. The scratches remained, small and deliberate, etched into the wood like a question. Who else was here? And why? The air seemed heavier on the way back to the house, the wind curling around the corners as if carrying whispers. Back inside, the house settled again. The floor groaned, doors whispered, shadows shifted. I sat by the window, tracing the moonlight across the floorboards. I couldn't tell if I had imagined the footsteps, the breathing, or if the house was trying to speak to me in ways I had never learned to hear. My chest ached with a quiet tension, a knowledge that something unseen was close, patient, and deliberate. I lay back down, listening to the rhythm of the house, the echoes in the walls. The scratches near the loft stayed in my mind, a faint pulse beneath my ribs. Someone had been here. Something had left its mark. And I knew I would return. Not just to look, but to understand. The wind rose outside, whistling through the eaves, brushing across the barn like it carried a secret. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the room, waiting, listening. The house, the barn, the loft, they weren't empty. Not really. And I felt, for the first time, that maybe I wasn't either. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I approached Mrs. Harlan's house. Smoke drifted lazily from her chimney, curling into the grey sky. Her garden was overgrown, winter weeds bowing under the pale light. I hesitated at the gate, watching her silhouette move slowly behind the curtains, then reached up to knock. She opened the door before I could, leaning heavily on the frame. Her hair was white and pulled back tight, skin lined like the pages of an old book. Her eyes caught mine, sharp but wary. She didn't invite me in. She didn't even smile. "Clara," she said, voice low, careful. "You shouldn't be asking about that barn." I stepped closer, the cold creeping through my coat. I don't understand it," I said. "The place feels different. Strange noises at night. Scratches in the loft. I thought maybe." "Some doors aren't meant to open," she interrupted, her gaze piercing, unwavering. "Some stories aren't yours to know." She paused, tilting her head slightly. The words hung between us, heavy, weighted with decades I couldn't see. Her eyes softened just a little, but there was still that undercurrent of fear. And pity. She knew something, but she wouldn't, or couldn't, say it. I shifted, unsure what to say next. Her house smelled faintly of herbs and dust, of wood and fire, the kind of smell that presses against your chest and makes you breathe slowly to remember you're alive. I noticed her hands resting on the doorway, knuckles white, as if holding back more than just conversation. "I just want to understand," I whispered. She shook her head slowly. "Understanding isn't always safe. Some things stay hidden for a reason. The town, we all know. We all protect. Some truths," she added, almost to herself, "they'll swallow you if you chase them." I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest, like snow falling slowly on bare branches. I wanted to argue, to press for details, to make her tell me something concrete. But the way her gaze lingered, the quiet in the room, the sense of watching decades unfold silently behind her eyes, it kept me still. I nodded, muttering a quiet thanks, and stepped back into the cold. The walk home was long and quiet. The wind whispered across the fields, rustling dry grass and scattered leaves. I couldn't shake the sense that the town itself was holding its breath, watching me as I passed. Every familiar house along the road felt older, heavier, as though each one carried its own set of unspoken rules. The barn waited somewhere beyond my view, patient, indifferent, but undeniably present. That night, sleep came slowly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing the house breathe around me. The shadows from the corners of the room shifted as if alive, stretching toward the loft in the barn I hadn't yet dared to revisit. And then the dream began. I was standing in the barn. The air smelled of straw and something metallic I couldn't name. The loft door was open, though I remembered it being closed. A figure stood there, indistinct at first, just a silhouette framed by the pale moonlight that filtered through the rafters. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, patient, waiting. I wanted to call out, to step forward, but my feet were rooted. The figure remained, quiet, almost gentle, yet impossible to read. Its presence felt familiar and foreign at once, like a memory I'd never lived but somehow recognized. I could hear the faintest creak above me, a floorboard groaning, and the smell of dust and hay deepened around me. I tried to speak in the dream, but no sound came. The figure shifted, just a little, and the loft seemed to stretch upward, endless and waiting. I understood, in a way I couldn't explain, that the truth wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried. It was simply silent. Waiting. Watching. Protected by the shadows, by the walls, by the unspoken caution of those who had come before me. I woke with a start, the sheets twisted around my arms, heart hammering, lungs tight. The room was quiet, the house settling around me, groaning in its familiar way. The image of the figure lingered, etched into my mind. I could still feel its gaze, patient and persistent, and a cold awareness settled in my chest. The truth was here, just out of reach, held in silence. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing against my eyelids. Mrs. Harlan's words returned, soft and heavy. Some doors aren't meant to open. Some stories aren't yours to know. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing across the barn, tugging at the loose boards. I felt a pull, quiet but insistent, as though the house itself was asking me a question I wasn't ready to answer. The loft waited. The figure waited. And I knew, somehow, that the story I had come to uncover was already watching me back. The barn smelled of wet straw and old wood, the kind of smell that presses against your chest and lingers even after you leave. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the boards, thin lines of gold cutting across dust motes that floated like tiny ghosts. I pushed the wheelbarrow slowly across the uneven floor, boots sinking slightly into damp hay. Every step made the barn groan, as if complaining at my presence. I paused, noticing the patches of straw that seemed disturbed, softer than the rest. My fingers traced the edges, brushing away decades of decay. Beneath, a wooden panel shifted slightly under my touch, hidden just enough to go unnoticed. The air carried the faint scent of rust and earth, a cold, lingering weight. I knelt, brushing away the straw carefully, heart pounding. The panel was heavier than it looked, but the hinges held, silent and stubborn. I hesitated. My hands hovered over the trapdoor, a quiet tension thrumming through my veins. This was the threshold I had feared, the one that had haunted my curiosity for weeks. Sunlight danced across the floor, falling in fragmented lines, illuminating the space like it was waiting. I pressed down gently, and the board gave a soft creak, moving under my weight. Dust rose in a slow swirl, motes catching the light like fragile stars. The barn felt alive around me. A crow cawed somewhere outside, echoing through the rafters. The floorboards groaned beneath my knees. I drew a slow breath, smelling straw, rust, damp earth, and something older I couldn't name. It was familiar and alien all at once, like a memory I had forgotten I was carrying. The air pressed closer as I pushed the trapdoor further open, revealing a dark cavity beneath. I peered into the shadows, the light barely reaching the bottom. Something glimmered faintly, catching the last of the afternoon sun, a corner of metal, smooth and deliberate. My pulse quickened, thumping loudly in my ears. The box or object beneath the trapdoor seemed almost impossible, like it shouldn't exist yet it did. I swallowed, tasting the dust in my mouth. My hands shook slightly, hovering at the edge. Could I bring myself to look? Could I bear to see what had been hidden here all along? I took a step back, letting the barn breathe around me. Every sound seemed amplified, the whine of wind through the boards, the creak of a rafter above, the faint shuffle of some small creature in the corner. I pressed my palm to the trapdoor again, feeling the cold, rough wood under my fingers, the tremor of my own anticipation. This was more than a discovery. It was an invitation. Or a warning? I knelt again, pushing the door fully open. The darkness beneath seemed to swallow the light. I could see the edges of the box more clearly now, metallic glints catching in the faint golden lines of dust. I hesitated, letting the silence stretch between me and the unknown. The barn seemed to inhale with me, the shadows curling closer, waiting. My heartbeat slowed just enough to hear it, steady, stubborn, insisting I proceed. I reached in carefully, fingers brushing the top of the box. The metal was cool, almost icy, yet strangely comforting. I traced its edges slowly, imagining what it might contain. Papers, letters, objects from a life that belonged to someone else, perhaps even him. The trapdoor smelled of damp earth, rust, and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. I could feel the weight of decades pressing against me, every memory embedded in the wood and stone around me. The barn felt quieter now, as if holding its breath. Dust motes hung suspended in the slanting sunlight, catching on the edges of the box like they were pointing, guiding me. I let my fingers linger, brushing along the surface, feeling each imperfection, each mark of age. This was the threshold I had longed for. I had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways, and yet reality felt heavier, denser than my imagination ever allowed. I exhaled slowly, tasting the cold air mixed with straw and rust. I could see every corner of the trapdoor, every shadow beneath the box, and yet part of me hesitated. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was reverence. Respect for the past, for the things left behind, for the weight of silence and memory. My hands hovered over the lid, trembling slightly, the question stretching in the space between the hay and the shadows. Do I open it? I looked up, the sun dipping lower outside the barn, spilling long, fractured lines of light across the floor. The air smelled of damp hay and the earth beneath it, warm and cold at once. I felt the barn around me, its weight, its patience, its quiet insistence. The box waited. The secrets waited. And I, finally, understood that what lay beneath the trapdoor was not just hidden. It had been waiting for me, for someone who would notice, who would care to see. I knelt there a long moment, listening to the silence, the gentle creak of the rafters, the distant whistle of the wind. My fingers rested on the lid. The threshold trembled beneath my touch. I drew a slow, deep breath and let the world hold me in the hush before revelation. The barn waited. The box waited. And I, at last, knew that this moment, quiet, trembling, alive, was the one I had been searching for all along. The barn smelled of damp hay and cold wood, the air thick with dust and something older, waiting. Sunlight cut thin lines through the cracks in the boards, falling across the trapdoor I had just opened. I knelt beside the box, fingers brushing over the edges. The lid was rough, splintered, cold against my palms. The faint scent of metal and earth clung to it, a memory pressed into the air. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside, a stack of letters lay tied with a brittle ribbon, yellowed with age, edges curling like dried leaves. The ribbon crumbled slightly under my touch. I lifted the top letter gently, aware that even the sound of paper moving seemed loud in the stillness of the barn. I traced the handwriting with my finger, familiar yet foreign, elegant and precise. My breath caught. The letters were addressed to him. To my husband. From someone I had never known existed. The ink had faded in some places, but the words remained clear. Debts, shame, things hidden in shadows, a past I hadn't suspected. Each line pulled me deeper into a life I had only glimpsed in fragments, in stories left untold. The barn seemed colder, the silence heavier. Even the light felt thin and fragile. I sat back on my heels, letting the first letter rest in my lap. I read slowly, aloud only in whispers, tasting each word. There was a carefulness to the writing, a deliberate pacing, as though the author had known it would one day be found. Each letter spoke of a man I thought I knew, and yet, here was someone else entirely, folded into him, hidden beneath the warmth I had thought unshakable. The shadows in the corners deepened. Dust motes hung like ghosts in the sunlight. I ran a hand through my hair, shivering despite the mild afternoon. The letters spoke of debts not just financial, but moral. Of a shame carried across years. Of a single event, long buried, that neither he nor anyone else had ever shared. I felt the weight of it pressing through the pages, into the barn, into me. I reached for the next letter, gingerly untied the brittle ribbon, and felt it snap slightly, like the breaking of a small seal. The letters piled in my lap, a fragile tower of truths. I realized that some parts of him I would never reach, layers folded in secrecy, protected either by love or fear. The warmth I had once believed in felt like a thin veneer over something denser, older, and more complex. The barn held its breath around me. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind through the cracks, seemed amplified. I glanced toward the loft, the shadows stretching along the walls, and wondered if he had ever stood here, reading the same letters, or hiding them, or hiding from them. Had he protected me, shielding my innocence from what he thought I didn't need to know? Or had he protected someone else entirely? I felt the weight of decades in my hands, of choices and silence. The letters smelled faintly of paper and ink, and something I couldn't name, something like regret or fear. I lingered over the edges, over the words, over the pauses between sentences. Every crease, every fold, every subtle mark held intention. It was a presence, quiet but undeniable, pressing in with each revelation. I leaned back against the hay bale, letting the letters rest across my knees. My heartbeat was loud in the stillness, and yet the barn was quieter than I had ever known it. I realized that love does not always reveal itself fully, that the people we hold closest can carry worlds we cannot enter. And perhaps, some truths are meant to remain partly hidden, even from those we trust most. I traced the ribbon with my fingertips, brittle, fading, fragile. The light was shifting, slanting longer across the floor, golden and thin. I didn't know whether to feel anger, grief, or gratitude. Perhaps all at once. Perhaps none. The barn held its silence like a breath, and I understood that some things would remain unanswered. Some doors would stay closed, even after they were opened. I tied the ribbon loosely again, careful not to disturb the letters more than necessary. I brushed hay from my sleeves and let the box rest closed before me, cold and weighty. Outside, a crow called, and the wind rustled through the eaves. The barn seemed to exhale, carrying the scent of straw, dust, and something older, deeper than memory. I stood slowly, placing a hand on the edge of the trapdoor, listening. The letters were here. The truth was here, hidden in plain sight. And yet, the question lingered like smoke in the air. Did he shield me, or someone else? The barn waited, patient, silent, its shadows long and unwavering. I turned toward the door, knowing that the story was only beginning, and that the layers I could not reach would always hum just beyond the edge of light. The barn was quiet again, the sunlight slanting in thin, dusty beams through the gaps in the boards. I had the box open in front of me, letters tied with brittle ribbon stacked neatly, and now, tucked beneath them, were photographs. The smell of old paper mixed with straw and dust, thick and intimate. I lifted the first photo, careful, as though my fingers might tear more than the paper, as if touching it could awaken whatever memories had been pressed into it. The image showed the barn, older than it was now. The wood was darker, slick with weather, shadows heavier. Figures moved within the frame, blurred, half hidden, like smoke caught in sunlight. I could not recognize the faces. My chest tightened at the thought that someone had been here before me, watching, living, hiding. Each photograph seemed to pulse with a quiet insistence. Look closer. Remember. I traced the edges with my fingertips, following the grain of the paper. Another photo, the loft door slightly ajar, shadow spilling across the floorboards. I leaned in, squinting. Who had opened it? When? A cold draft of unease ran down my spine. The barn felt different now, heavier, patient, waiting. I flipped another, then another, each frame a fragment of a life I had never known existed. The figures shifted across the photographs like a secret dance. Some faces blurred deliberately, some hidden behind posts, hands, or the blur of motion. I felt the weight of intention behind each one. Someone had chosen what to show, what to hide, and why. The letters spoke of debts, of shame, of things kept in shadow. The photographs seemed to answer the letters without speaking. There are connections you cannot yet see. I sat cross-legged on the hay, spreading the photos in front of me like pieces of a puzzle. The sunlight moved, shadows stretching, curling around the edges of the images. I noticed how some of the same figures appeared in different photos, in different places, their positions shifting in subtle ways. A timeline began to emerge, faint and fragile, connecting moments across years. Past and present mirrored each other in the angles of the barn, the tilt of doors, the placement of shadows. I felt a tremor in my chest, a recognition I couldn't name. The loft door in the photos, slightly open, slightly inviting, slightly defiant, mirrored the scratches I had found weeks ago. Someone had been here. Someone had left traces. And those traces weren't just physical. They were emotional, deliberate, layered. I realized that the man I loved had inhabited this barn long before I arrived, his presence woven into the walls and shadows in ways I had never considered. The photographs carried tension, subtle but unrelenting. I noticed a hand pressed against a post in one frame, blurred, almost ghost-like. In another, a figure seemed to glance toward the camera, though no one else was looking. I wondered if these moments were candid, or staged, or perhaps warnings left for someone who might come after. My fingers lingered on the edges of a photo, tracing the lines of shadow and light. I could feel the eyes behind the images, patient, curious, waiting. Time stretched thin as I pieced together the scenes, overlaying memories from the letters with the frames before me. I could see relationships forming, tensions unspoken, debts carried silently across years. Someone had moved through this space, guided by secrets, protecting or hiding something. I realized the barn was not just a place, it was a container of stories, of lives folded into the grain of the wood, of moments that had chosen to stay. I paused at one photograph, the loft door ajar, a shadow spilling across the floor. My heartbeat slowed, measured and deliberate. Someone had opened that door. Perhaps they had been careful. Perhaps they had been desperate. I could almost hear the faint creak of the hinge in the silence of the barn, the brush of footsteps against straw. I pressed my palm to the photograph as if I could absorb its memory through my skin. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing through the gaps in the boards, whispering across the hay. The air smelled of cold, of straw, and something older, deeper than memory. The barn seemed to lean in closer, pressing its quiet around me, asking questions I did not yet know how to answer. The photographs lay scattered across the floor like fragments of a language I was only beginning to read. I stacked them carefully, holding the top one for a long moment. Faces blurred, doors ajar, shadows stretching across wood and straw, they were not random. They were deliberate. Someone had left them here, layered into time, into space, into the barn itself. And now, I was part of it, standing at the edge of the story, holding pieces of a past I had never suspected. The sunlight waned, slipping through the cracks, painting long, fractured lines across the floor. I let the photographs rest on the hay, stacked and fragile, and stepped back. The barn exhaled around me, its silence heavy, patient, waiting. I could feel the weight of the past pressing forward, pulling me closer to truths I had not yet touched. And I realized, quietly, that the loft door, the same door in the photographs, the same scratches I had found, had always been asking the same question. Who opens it? And when? The ladder groaned beneath my weight, each creak echoing softly in the still barn. Sunlight had thinned to a wan, late afternoon gold, spilling through the cracks in the boards. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, settling over my hair and shoulders like a quiet shroud. My hands shook as I gripped the loft door, the key cold and heavy in my palm. The moment I had feared and longed for had arrived. I paused, one foot on the ladder, breathing shallow, listening to the barn around me. The wind rattled the panels outside, carrying a faint smell of earth and hay. The floorboards seemed patient, holding their history beneath me. I could almost hear the echo of footsteps long gone, the weight of people who had moved through this space before me, leaving fragments of themselves behind. The loft door resisted at first, stiff hinges whining in protest. I pressed harder, letting the key turn slowly, deliberately. The latch released with a small click, subtle but immense. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of light as I eased the door open, peering inside. The air was thick, warm, and stale, heavy with years of neglect. I hesitated, my chest tight, inhaling the mixture of hay, dust, and something older I could not name. Inside, the loft was small, shadowed, intimate. Objects were carefully placed, as though arranged by memory itself, A worn coat folded on a chair, a tin box with a faded label, a handful of letters stacked neatly on the floor. My fingers hovered over them, trembling. Each item seemed to hum with presence, personal and stubborn, refusing to be ignored. I breathed slowly, letting the space hold me, letting the quiet settle around the edges of my awareness. I picked up the letters first, carefully untied the ribbon that bound them. One letter, thicker than the rest, had my husband's handwriting, familiar and intimate. I traced the ink slowly, as if touching the words could slow time itself. The letter spoke of love and regret, of mistakes and protection, of choices made to shield those he loved and those he could not. The words pressed against me, raw, human, devastatingly honest. I sank onto the loft floor, the dust clinging to my clothes, the objects arranged around me like a circle of memory. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the letter, reading line by line. He wrote of fear, of a life entangled with people and obligations I had never known, of sorrow he carried silently. He wrote not to excuse himself, but to offer truth. And in that truth, I felt a weight, heavy, impossible, yet unburdened. The man I loved, flawed and human, had lived layers of life I would never fully know. The other items in the loft caught my eye, a photograph folded in a corner, a key on a string, a small carved box with initials I didn't recognize. They were fragments of existence, reminders that lives are woven with both light and shadow, choices and consequences. I ran my fingers over each, feeling the echoes of a past long sealed, memories pressed into wood, paper, and fabric. The barn itself seemed to shift in response. It no longer felt menacing, or patient, or waiting. It felt like a keeper of memory, a guardian of moments and truths too fragile to remain outside its walls. The wind outside carried a faint whistle, brushing through the gaps in the boards, gentle now, not urgent. I realized that the barn had not been threatening. It had been inviting, guiding me toward understanding. I folded the letter back into the ribbon, careful, reverent. I looked around the loft once more, letting the light play across the objects, shadows stretching long and thin across the wooden boards. The truth I had discovered was personal, intimate, and devastating. But it was also grounding, tethering me to the life we had lived, to choices made in love and fear. I understood now that memory and honesty do not always arrive comfortably. They arrive fully, and demand recognition. I descended the ladder slowly, the wood creaking under my careful steps. My mind traced each line of the letter, each object, each photograph, each echo of sound that had carried me here. Outside, the wind moved the panels, rustling hay in the loft, and I felt the barn breathe with me, quiet, patient, knowing. Stepping into the yard, the sun had dipped lower, painting the landscape in muted gold and shadow. The barn stood solid, sentinel-like, holding the loft and its secrets. I understood now that some knowledge comes at a cost, the reckoning of memory, the weight of truth. And yet, I felt a quiet resolve, the kind that comes from seeing what is, and choosing to carry it forward. The wind shifted again, brushing against my coat, carrying the faint scent of earth, hay, and old wood. The barn exhaled in silence, a keeper of memory, patient, unwavering. And I realized that I, too, would move forward, shaped by what I had found, carrying both loss and love, fear and understanding. The loft, the letters, the objects, the barn, all had given me a story I could not have imagined. And as I turned toward the house, the last light falling across the yard, I knew this knowledge was mine to hold. How I would carry it, I did not yet know. But the barn had offered me its truth. And that was enough for now. The house was quiet, quieter than usual, as if it had been holding its breath all day. I walked slowly through the rooms, boots barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. Light from the late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, cutting soft, golden lines across dust motes suspended in the air. Each room felt different now, heavier, more patient, as though it remembered everything I had overlooked. I stopped in the living room, hand brushing over the edge of the table, lingering on the grooves left by years of cups and knives. Conversations I had dismissed, fragments of laughter, the way he had said certain words, I remembered them all now, small clues tucked into the corners of ordinary moments. My chest tightened. I could feel the weight of every secret pressing against the walls, against me. I moved through the kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom, letting my fingers trail along doorframes and banisters. Each touch felt like a question. Did I notice this before? Did I ignore it because I wasn't ready? Or because I didn't want to know? The silence of the house responded with creaks and groans, the floorboards whispering beneath my feet, the corners holding their breath, waiting. I stepped outside, and the wind had risen, scattering dry leaves across the gravel. It rattled the panels of the barn, the sound sharp and hollow, echoing through the yard like a warning. I pulled my coat tighter, letting the cold press against me. The barn loomed ahead, familiar and alien at once, the loft door just visible in the fading light. My pulse quickened, a quiet drum in my chest, signaling that the threshold I had feared for so long was close. I remembered the letters, the photographs, the scratches in the loft. Each detail pressed against my memory, forming a map of a life I hadn't fully seen. Faces blurred, doors ajar, shadows lingering, all signs pointing toward something I could no longer ignore. I swallowed the lump in my throat and walked closer, boots crunching softly on the straw-strewn floor. Inside, the air smelled of hay, dust, and faint metal from the trapdoor. I knelt beside it, fingers tracing the edges, the wood rough and cold beneath my palms. The box I had found rested nearby, its secrets pressed tightly beneath the brittle ribbon. I could almost hear the letters whispering, telling me that some truths demand a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. I stood slowly, letting my eyes drift upward to the loft. The door was still slightly ajar in my mind's eye, a memory mirrored from the photographs. I imagined the steps it would take to reach it, the creak of each board under my weight. Fear tangled with inevitability. I could no longer pretend ignorance. Whatever lay beyond that door, whatever had been hidden, was waiting. I inhaled slowly, the air thick with anticipation. My hands trembled lightly as I reached for the loft door, the wind outside rattling the barn's panels as if echoing my hesitation. Every creak of the floorboard beneath me sounded like a heartbeat. I pressed my palm against the wood, listening, feeling the weight of all the moments I had missed, all the silences I had allowed. And then I realized, the reckoning had begun long before I stepped into the barn. It had been growing inside me, tucked into memories, folded into the conversations I had brushed off, hiding in the spaces between words. Each fragment pointed toward the truth, each pause in speech, each glance he had given, they were all part of the threshold I now faced. I knelt again, letting my hand rest lightly on the loft door. The barn seemed to lean in closer, the shadows curling around me like they were waiting for a choice. The wind whispered, carrying the faint scent of earth and hay, pressing against the door, as though urging me forward. I could feel my own pulse in my fingertips, steady and insistent, insisting that I move, that I see, that I confront. The loft held its secrets patiently. I could almost hear it breathing, listening, knowing. I imagined the moment I would step over the threshold, the cold air pressing against me, the shadows bending around whatever lay within. The house and the barn and the memories all pressed in, quiet but insistent. The reckoning was not just out there. It was here, inside me, folded into every hesitation, every whispered question I had avoided. I took one final breath, letting the wind sweep over me, rattling the panels, brushing across the hay, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. The loft waited, patient, silent, unyielding. Fear and anticipation twined together, heavy and insistent. And I knew that stepping forward was no longer optional. The price of truth demanded its moment. The sky was soft with early light, a pale wash of pink and grey stretching across the horizon. Frost clung to the edges of the grass, sparkling faintly where the sun had yet to reach. I stepped outside, boots crunching lightly over the frozen earth, and felt the cold press against my cheeks, sharp but clear. Behind me, the barn stood quiet, still, holding its secrets without threat, its shadows long and patient in the new day. I held the letter close to my chest, the paper folded and warm against my fingers. The ink had faded in places, but the weight of the words remained, pressing gently into me. Grief lingered at the edges, familiar and tender, but it was joined now by something else, understanding. Not the kind that excuses or softens, but the kind that allows the heart to breathe, even when the past is heavy. The air smelled of cold earth, hay, and wood, the sense of the life I had inherited, of moments lived and hidden. I breathed slowly, letting each inhalation settle the dust in my lungs, letting the quiet fill the spaces where tension had been. The house behind me, the barn, the land itself, they felt like companions now, part of a story larger than myself, larger than grief. They held memory, yes, but also resilience, waiting for someone willing to carry it forward. I walked toward the edge of the yard, boots crunching softly, tracing the lines of frost across the grass. The letters and objects in the loft had weighed on me like stone, but here in the cold dawn, the weight shifted. It became something more, a tether, linking past to present, love to loss, mistakes to understanding. I felt the air clear around me, as if the land itself were breathing with me, exhaling decades of quiet, pressing history into clarity. My mind wandered back to him, to the man I had loved, flawed and human, layered in ways I had only begun to perceive. The letter, the objects, the photographs, they told a story that was both intimate and distant, tender and terrible. And yet, holding them in memory rather than in hand, I felt the sting of sorrow but also the pulse of empathy. He had lived, and hidden, and protected, in ways I might never fully know. The barn, once a place of suspense and unease, now seemed to hum quietly in its own rhythm. Its boards and shadows, its loft and hidden corners, were no longer menacing. They were guardians of memory, witnesses to choices, carriers of truths that could not always be spoken. I ran a hand along the edge of the door, lingering over the worn wood, and felt the weight of the past lighten, just a fraction, in the morning light. I turned slowly toward the house, tracing the line of windows, the porch, the familiar angles softened by dawn. The land stretched outward, quiet, patient, inviting. I imagined life beyond inherited silence, a rhythm of days that included both memory and movement, grief and possibility. The wind tugged gently at my coat, carrying the faint scent of pine and soil, grounding me in the present. I could feel the cold pressing through my gloves, sharp and honest, reminding me that I was still here, still alive, still able to choose. I pressed the letter to my chest again, letting the words and the weight of his life settle alongside my own. The grief that had felt heavy in the loft now mingled with something like forgiveness, not a clean or complete forgiveness, but a soft, tentative one. For him, for myself, for the past that had shaped me. The air seemed to carry it, sweeping through the barn, across the frost, over the fields, and into me. For a long moment, I stood in the yard, boots cold, breath visible in the air, heart steadying. The barn, the house, the land, they had held me, guided me, offered me a glimpse of truths I had not yet dared to face. And now, in the pale light of dawn, the story they carried felt less like a burden and more like inheritance, something I could honor, remember, and move beyond. I exhaled slowly, the cold air rushing past my lips, feeling it fill my chest and push outward, carrying a quiet release. The frost sparkled faintly in the sunlight, and the barn seemed to shift imperceptibly, its shadow softening, almost smiling in patient acknowledgement. I knew that the past would remain with me, but that I, too, had a place in the present, a life that could unfold beyond what had been hidden, beyond what had been lost. I stepped forward, boots pressing into the soft, frozen grass, holding the letter close. The morning air was sharp and grounding, the horizon open and pale, the barn behind me still, its secrets no longer threatening. And in that quiet, fragile peace, I understood, forgiveness, for him, for myself, for the past, was a possibility. Not sudden, not complete, but enough to begin.